Hi everyone, welcome to our video helping you out with some additional tips for writing your narrative literature review. Dr. Diran asked me to share some of the tips that I have found helpful as I have gone through my various doctoral courses. And as you know, currently right now I'm writing my literature review for my dissertation, probably the most important one I'll ever write. So here we go. I'm going to share some of the tips that I have found helpful. So in order for you to make sure that you're on the right track, you want to keep in mind what is the purpose of your narrative literature review. And some of that just comes back to revisiting what Dr. Teran has, defined as an NLR. And for me, I like to consider it like telling a story, an organized story about what's been done in the research about your topic. So you're going out there, you're going to fish, right? You're going to find all these articles that you all have already done and, organized and summarized in your annotated bibliographies. And then you have to organize it into themes. And then from there, draw some bigger conclusions. You want it to be as inclusive as possible of all the articles that you found that actually met your inclusion criteria. And so you want to make sure that you have specified at the beginning what is exactly the inclusion criteria for your articles. So are they going to be only peer reviewed? Are they going to only be from, 2015 and up? Are they going to be empirical only, et cetera? Are you going to stick to US or English only? So those are some of the inclusion criteria. So you want to make sure that's clearly stated out. Also, when you think about what an NLR is, the ultimate purpose is you're showing that you are now familiar with all the important professional articles and literature on your topic. So you want to make sure you are up to date, especially if there's something that's happened recently in your topic, something that's been controversial, any debates that have gone on, you want to be aware of them. You want to make sure you're not just looking at the stuff you want to see, that you're not just being biased, but also that you've been pretty objective. You've gone out there and you've given it due worth. So, you just ask yourself, like, when I'm reading these articles and they're referring to classic works or major works, have you included those? Have you considered which debates are happening? And is there anything else that maybe you want to make sure you include in there? For this presentation, I'm going to just quickly go over how to revise your purpose statement now that you've done some research. Your main research is now concluded. So now, like, how do you put this research into, an actual report where you're showing what you found in the literature? Also, like, how can you go about and maybe some tips on coding and how to create your themes? And then finally, just some general tips that I have found helpful on writing academic papers. So as you're now looking back at all your annotated bibliographies, and maybe you have it all consolidated into one long one, you want to come back through and look at your articles and look for, first of all, which ones are the most relevant, so you can kind of rank order them. I like to have one annotated bibliography where they're but in alphabetical order, but I also like to have them in subtables where I'll say, like, this one is specifically about this topic, or once you have your themes, you might want to organize them into themes. But also you might want to have a table where it shows, like, okay, this one's the most relevant to the least relevant. And once we're getting into like really, articles that don't have much relevance, then that's when you should question, like, do they even belong in your literature review? So that's kind of a way to go through your articles with like a magnifying glass and say, how many of these articles are super relevant to what I'm, looking at, and then how many of them maybe I could do without. You still need to meet the minimum requirement of sources. So keep that in mind. If you do pull one out because you start realizing, hey, it's not that relevant, it's not that connected to what I'm trying to do, then you need to replace it with something else. And a good way to do that some tips on that is like looking at the articles that you consider most relevant. And in those articles, what did they cite as their literature review sources? And, usually they take a stance on, okay, this was the first thing that happened, or this was one of the most significant studies that occurred. And then kind of look at their bibliography, their references, and see if you have included those primary articles that they're referring to. So that's something to do. Make sure that you've included any primary sources that your other articles are referring to. As far as credibility, you want to make sure that your articles are coming from everything that meets your inclusion criteria. So you want to come back through, with a magnifying glass. And if you said everything was going to be empirical, then you should have no literature reviews. You should have no opinion articles. You should have no, statements from the president or special projects or things like that. So you need to come back through and make sure each one of those articles meets your inclusion criteria. And then it is good when you have an inclusion criteria. Some people consider it redundant, but it is good to also specify what was excluded from your research and why. And so that one kind of helps, especially like on a dissertation or on a master's thesis, in case somebody says, well, I read about this study, how come it wasn't included? And you already can show like it did not meet, this inclusion criteria and therefore it was excluded. And then finally, when it comes to the quality of the studies, just because something got published, I'm sure you're finding out that it doesn't mean that it had high standards that it met when it came to methodology or how they analyzed the findings. Maybe they used statistics weirdly, or maybe they used a theme that, and we saw this as you were summarizing your articles for your annotated bibliographies, is that sometimes, the theme categories that they used were not appropriate, or they had no mutual exclusivity. They were overlapping, and therefore it was difficult to identify which of the categories they should land into. So, you can come back through, and if you feel like an article is lacking in solid methodology or lacking in, themes or analyses, any of that, then, you might want to consider either replacing it if you can find a better article, or if you consider it still a high quality article for other reasons, then make sure that you recognize that and that you explain it. So things that you're looking for as far as coming back through and looking through your articles, now that you have a nice little collection, you should have about 20, is, now you're coming back through and you're asking for like, what are some common assumptions that researchers in that field tend to express? Are there common theoretical frameworks that they're referring to? A lot of times in your annotated bibliographies, you mentioned CRT. So, when we look at critical race theory and we're looking at how it was used in this study, are we seeing that run through multiple of the studies that we used? So if we're seeing that it comes through and CRT keeps coming through, then that's going to be one of the theoretical frameworks that we want to acknowledge. As far as methodologies, the first way you can organize an article is it quantitative, or is it qualitative, or is it mixed methods? So that's one way to come back through and look at your articles and see, okay, out of 20 articles or 20 studies, 12 of them were qualitative, 6 of them were quantitative, and 2 of them were mixed methods. I like making a table out of this, and so that's something that you might want to consider. And that way, okay, oh wow, out of this topic, it looks like the majority of research that I covered was qualitative, or it looks like the majority of research being done here is quantitative. So those tables help you kind of make those decisions. Same thing for like, how are they using any kind of testing procedures? Are they, what subject pool do they like to draw from? Do they study mainly teachers, in-service teachers, or do they like to study students in the classroom? Or do they use college students, or, do they use businesses? Whatever it is, like, who is their subject pool most frequently involving? And then are there any certain materials that the researchers like to, use, and that you're hearing about that are recurring themes across the different studies that you've seen? One of the things that you want to know at the kind of once you've done your 20 articles, if you've done a good job in scanning, and collecting the most important articles, then you should see some recurring expert names coming up. You'll see words like sometimes the writer will say, a classic study, or, a groundbreaking study, or a controversial study. And so sometimes they'll reference that because they're showing you that, hey, this kind of empirical study right here, this one really stood out. Also, of course, you can always look at how many times it's been cited on Google Scholar. That's another way to see, like, has this article had a lot of impact. And so you can see recurring names, you can see the labs they're referencing, or maybe the university, and they'll say Columbia has found blah, 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 repeatedly over and over again. So you do want to be familiar with who are considered the leading experts in your field, and make sure that you've covered, their latest findings and maybe some of their earliest contributions, and make sure those are considered as part of your literature review collection. If you've stumbled upon some kind of debate or some kind of conflicting theories, maybe where, one takes a particular stance that another theory completely disagrees with, those are, again, important to cover. And it's something that maybe you find out for the first time as you're putting, the research together. But also sometimes those conflicting theories have already been discussed because they've been ongoing, and they've been covered in some of the previous literature reviews. So it is good to find a literature review for your literature review about your topic. But you want to keep in mind, literature reviews change constantly. You and I could do one right now. Our findings would be completely different. And, we still should have some of the primary important findings, but as far as what angle do we take with it, what themes are we looking at? Sometimes people write a very detailed paper just on subject pool. And, like, it's all going to be about, okay, these are the only studies that use elementary students for studying, intelligence. And so at that point, you're looking at intelligence from a very narrow perspective. And so we end up with very different literature reviews. And then also timing. Like, what I write today could be very different than what's written about 5 years from now, because research is ongoing and it's cumulative. And so we have to make sure that, we recognize that literature reviews are not like a done deal, right? It's not like it's one product and that's it and it's over. They're constantly, the information that can be used for them is constantly evolving. And therefore, we could have absolutely different, products from our lit reviews occur over time. And so those are things to, keep in mind as you're doing your research. It is good to have a past literature review, sometimes a systematic literature review that's been done, because systematic is actually trying to go out there and find everything that exists, from the beginning to the present. And those are good to find. And even if they're not exactly about your topic, sometimes they're very related. And that way you get a good feel of, okay, these were like leading names, leading authors in the research. Because sometimes, maybe you did your research using Google Scholar, and you went through EBSCOhost, and you went through ProQuest, and you went through these different search engines, and you could have possibly not touched on some of these primary classic studies. So it is important to kind of have some big perspective that you can just to check yourself. Hey, do I have the big names that should be included in my topic? And of course, like how popular has a theory been? Sometimes, somebody presents a theory right now. I teach psychology. If you all remember, I teach psychology at EPCC. And right now I'm doing a class on personality. And everybody, comes to class, starts that class knowing who Freud was. But very, very few people have ever heard of some of the theorists that we cover in the class because they just weren't popular. I think one of the least popular theorists of all times was George Kelly. And, when I ask my students, like if they've ever heard of him or if they know anything about personal construct theory, they're usually like absolutely, clueless, and they're like, no, never heard of him, didn't even know he was a psychologist. And so, yeah, if your theory is not very popular, then, sometimes it's not referenced. And so you want to, be aware of, hey, this has been a popular theory, but also questioning why. Right? Why is it so popular? Is it because it's just easy and palatable, or is it because, it's been groundbreaking and it really, changed the way things are, et cetera. So those are all things that you should be looking for as you're, coming back through your articles and trying to make connections. You're connecting the dots, right? At that point. So once you've done your research, you should come back through and revise your topic statement. It might actually involve even changing the direction of your statement. So like pre-research, you had a topic statement and maybe it was very vague in general, and maybe you were lacking in accuracy, which is hopefully something you were because you hadn't done the research yet. And now that you've done the research, maybe now it's more precise, it's more detailed, and it's more inclusive of the themes that you hopefully eventually will identify. Right. So just a quick example on that. You want your topic statement to be more on target, right? So initially, maybe you started off with a general perspective, a very general, maybe even inaccurate perspective. Maybe it was just like, how does gender relate to academic success? And as you conducted your literature review and brought these articles together, you thought critically about them. And now you're sitting back and you're saying, okay, I can have more precision, right? So I can say, hey, there's high impact programs out there that have played a critical role in facilitating gender equity for academic success. So, as you collect this information, I mean, we're getting educated as we're reading these articles, and they build the body of knowledge for you. And so you do want to come back and revise that topic statement so that it can be more precise and more detailed. And, usually it will make you stand out, right? From what's been done in the past. Okay, let's talk briefly about like themes and coding. So what you're doing when it comes to themes and coding is you are, sorry guys, my dog's barking because somebody's at my door. When you're out there looking through everything now, if you remember, you already had to do your annotated bibliographies, um, and you had to actually identify themes. Sorry, I'm gonna take this outside. Maybe hear her barking as much outside. Um, she's loud too. I have the loudest barking dog on the planet, right? Okay, so so the what you're looking through, if you remember your box is where you were summarizing themes already. Here you're looking for like what are the patterns? What are the themes that are recurring? What do they most have in common? And then as far as, is there anything that's kind of contested, right? Okay, are there any trends that you're seeing in the research that could serve as your themes, right? Okay, maybe it involves, these search terms. That's one time, one way that you might identify themes is sometimes people identify, or the authors identify their search terms at the top near their abstract. And so that's good because you can look through those and see like, okay, what are some themes that are maybe coming clear through those search terms? But also as you read their methods, as you read their analyses, and as you read their findings, right? Okay, that's probably where you really want to zone in, is their findings. What was it that they found? And when it comes to your topic, you're going to have some that, found something that's very, very connected to your topic. And then you're going to find some articles that were maybe more distant, maybe didn't have as much relevance again. So those are some of the things that you might want to do when you're coding. It can actually be kind of difficult to do the coding for some people. And I always like to recommend, like, even with my students, to make it more tangible and to make it something that you can maybe actually, visualize in your head, is to put a lot of these topics possibly on a note card. And I know that sounds really old school, but when it comes to, trying to organize things into themes, if you have these studies and you have them kind of laid out in front of you, you can take a highlighter and you can, go through and look for some of the common, themes, ideas, concepts that are standing out for different articles. And so as you start organizing them, you might play with different categories. You might find, hey, there's 4 categories, or sometimes maybe you find out, you know what, they're not mutually exclusive. So you end up merging them into 3 categories. But I really do think it's nice to be able to play with things physically. It doesn't have to take that much time. It could literally be like, one statement where you talk about what did they find, right? And so really when it comes down to what did the study find, that's going to be, for an empirical study, that's their entire purpose, is what did they find? Did they find, if it's a quantitative study, did they find statistically significant results? If it's a qualitative study, what themes did they identify, right? And so that's where, like, you want to, focus kind of on your findings and put those on a note card and then kind of play from there. And there, you can look at, like, for me, I put these 2 topics just to give you an example. Like, maybe you take those different articles, those different studies, and you actually, organize them into, okay, there were 2 overlying themes, such as the gender with academic success, and then equitable engagement techniques. And so your review ends up being that most of the studies that you identified landed into one of these 2 categories. So I do recommend you using note cards. I do recommend that you use highlighters. I'm a very visual person. I'm very, with colors, they stand out for me. So I recommend that for you as well. And finally, on your theme selection, maybe you sit back and you ask yourself, is there a defining factor? Because, sometimes you have a lot of options here as to how you decide to organize your findings. And it could be that you decide, you know what, I'm going to go with, those studies that used elementary versus studies that use middle school kids, or I'm going to use studies that had, 10,000 plus subjects versus studies that had fewer than 10,000. So you end up drawing the line. You're the one who gets to draw those lines because it's your literature review. But you want to make sure those lines are helping you organize the findings so that you can give the reader a clearer picture of what, is out there. Remember, somebody wants to come to your literature review and not have to read 20 studies. They want to be able to read your article and from there have a nice, trustworthy, credible review of what 20 articles about that topic have found. And so if you focus on too many themes or you draw too many dividing lines, it can end up very confusing. So, and then you don't want it to be just a black and white world where you end up just dividing it into one, or 2 categories. So it is good to make sure that, you have enough categories and that they are mutually exclusive, with no overlap, because that will make it very difficult for you to decide where the article lands, right? What category should it go into? So, be careful about how many themes you end up with. Look them over, question yourself, like, is this actually mutually exclusive? If there is overlap, can you merge them into a broader category? And will it make sense to the reader? Right? Okay, so do spend some time doing that with your themes. And then this is my last slide, everybody. And I did want to point you to this site, and I will take you there shortly. And I just find this site really, really helpful. And so a lot of these tips are coming from that site here on this page. So this is, about writing your paper. And, people struggle, students struggle a lot of times. Some of you might struggle more than others to write. And when we know that it's a high stake assignment, maybe we take a long time to like even get started with it. So I would recommend for you to just sit down. It can be fun to play with note cards and the highlighters and just kind of get it into sections. Once you have it in sections, you can, put those 4 or 5 articles that all were about that one topic, that one theme, and then you can write these sections thematically. So like the first theme, write that section, write this, the second one, the third one, etc. So write your paper. Ultimately, your literature review can be written what I call from the ground up. So like individually, these little themes that we have, right? Okay, we write them in sections. And then from there, we take a bird's eye view, we fly over the sections, and we draw some broader conclusions. And then at the last thing we should be doing is like the introduction and the conclusion, right? Okay, so, try working on the body first and the individual sections of your paper. Some of the easiest stuff to do, and it gives you a lot of encouragement, is like, your parameters for your literature review. And this is where you talk about what websites did you use, what search engines, when did you run the searches, how many articles were produced from each search, etc. So that's some of the easiest stuff to do because you get something going and it kind of, it gives you motivation and gives you encouragement. And then, if you realize that, hey, you can write this big mountain called a literature review, but you can do it in little pieces that are much more easier to do and that you can break down into manageable sections. So I really do encourage you to, approach it thematically, like looking at, okay, I like this theme the most, so I'm going to go with this theme first. And then kind of put all the articles that, were about that theme, organize them into, which ones had similar findings, which ones had disagreements, which ones, used a certain survey or a certain assessment tool, et cetera. And, try to categorize them with similarities and differences. And then from there, write the section up and then go on to your next section and so forth. And before you know it, guys, I promise you'll have, what looks like, almost a completed product. So yeah, and then don't forget, once you have this draft and you've written it up, make sure you read it out loud. That's something I always do. I always recommend my students to do it. I used to teach speech at UTEP for 10 years, and I totally told my students to always read their stuff out loud. But if you're finding, for example, that each paragraph begins with a researcher's name, and this is straight from that website that I'm telling you right here, it might indicate that you actually aren't evaluating, comparing, and synthesizing from an analytical point of view, but instead are you just merely reporting what's been done. And remember, that's not the point of a lit review. So, kind of look for that as you're reading these, writing these thematic sections. Make sure that you're synthesizing, that you're evaluating, that you're comparing the articles to one another. Were they similar findings? Were they different? Why were they different? Ask yourself those questions. And ultimately, I love this advice is prioritize analysis over description, because you want your paper to not be something that looks like, okay, in this article, this blah blah blah, the researchers found that, okay, moving on to the next article. We don't want that. We want someone who can say, okay, 5 out of 20 articles have identified that the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is the most frequently used intelligence measure for adult college students, blah blah blah. So we want like synthesis, we want collective findings. We don't, as a reader, we don't want to read from individual article to individual article. So just check yourself for that, because synthesis, I think, is one of the things that students have the most difficulty with. And just to kind of take you to this website and share some more things, tips with you here from the website. Let me go there real quick. Oh, okay, it looks like it's stuck. Okay, stop share. All right, and I'm still here, and hopefully it's still recording. All right, and we're gonna go to the website. Okay, and let me share that with you. All right, and here it is. This is the one that I was recommending. This is one of many. There's many, many websites where you can, get tips for writing literature reviews. But I really like this one. There's video links. There's, there's a worksheet for working on your research question. Questions you should ask yourself when you're reading the articles, how to develop a purpose statement. There's even some templates for it. Actually writing the paper, this is where they stated prioritize analysis over description. And so I really like this website a lot, but I wanted to point out towards the bottom here, reviewing your work. Look at how great these tips are. You want to make sure that, if you were to only read that sentence, would you find that your paper was presenting a clear position? Was it developed logically from beginning to end? So those are, good questions to kind of ask yourself once you've written this, literature review draft. Can you make an outline for each section? And can you see the gaps, maybe missing information that you need to add, or maybe you need to delete the irrelevant stuff and restructure your sections? That happens a lot. The more you read it out loud, you'll be able to identify maybe even punctuation problems, or where you need to divide sentences, where maybe you have some grammatical errors, etc. And you're trying to show that familiarity, right? Do you know who the important professional literature authors are on that subject? So you want to make sure you're up to date, that you've got all the pertinent texts, right? Okay, and so as far as citations, references, I mean, we've been talking to you about APA formatting all along. You can use the Purdue OWL, you can use your APA manual. Just make sure that your citations are accurate and correctly formatted. And then, anytime you're, citing a source, you don't want to plagiarize. So you want to make sure that if you've taken 3 or more words directly from another source, they should be in quotation marks. But really, really, it's discouraged to use quotes unless it's something that's like really, really significant that you're going to see recurring on the different, studies. And so, yeah, I love these tips. Make sure you check out this page. This is one of many. There's also lots of YouTube videos that you can visit and just look up literature reviews. And yeah, I encourage you all to stay encouraged in writing your review. Don't get discouraged. And I hope you found this video helpful. All right, everybody. Bye now.